Okay, thank you. I'm really happy to go after these two presentations because I'm going to talk a little bit more about some qualitative findings we have from the agricultural industry. And so you have the foundation of the health effects in people. And so now I want to sort of ground it in the day-to-day reality of workers. So we already saw this picture, but this is a field down in the Oxnard area during one of the local fires a few years ago. And as Genevieve from MyCop talked about, workers were still out in the field working. And so it's really relevant right now to be thinking about the occupational hazards that not just farm workers, but construction workers, firefighters, utility workers are facing. And Cal OSHA Standards Board is likely to pass or enact a emergency regulation that all employers and employees who work outside are going to need to contend with in the coming fire season. And so I think that some of our findings can be helpful in thinking about how to train and prepare people for that, that regulation. So we're in California. California ag is very significant to the nation's produce, but I want to make sure everybody is aware of that for this discussion. California produces 2/3 of the fruit, nuts, 1/3 of vegetables. Most of the crops grown in California are labor intensive, and this is relevant because it involves humans picking or harvesting those crops. We have about 800,000 farm workers in California. Most do not work full time, and so the annual average wage is under $20,000. And this is really relevant when we think about housing, healthcare access, and other issues. It's predominantly male, Spanish-speaking. The unauthorized to work percentage is higher in California than the rest of the country. And again, that's really relevant when we think about how people access resources in emergencies. The health status of farm workers as a backdrop to smoke exposure is not entirely different than that of the regular population. There are high rates of obesity and diabetes. So there's the regular chronic diseases that the general population faces, but then there are the crowded dwellings, the lack of healthcare access, the political climate and immigration concerns that leave people, make it so people aren't wanting to seek resources. And then agriculture is a very dangerous industry. It is one of the most dangerous industries, and so people are facing trips and slips and pesticide exposure and heat illness on a regular basis. So this is the backdrop that people are experiencing when there's a fire event and there's wildfire smoke. I, like everybody, was probably trying to find the right image to get this across, and so I thankfully stumbled across a different one. On the left, what I was trying to do is highlight the fact that California ag is everywhere. There's not a county in California that doesn't have agriculture. You can see the darker counties have more agricultural labor. It's a map of the number of people working. And what I was hoping to do was overlay a map that showed, profound smoke spread through the Central Valley. And I wasn't successful, but I did find a CAL FIRE incident map that includes very small fires. Obviously, these are not all the major fires that we're talking about today, but there are fires everywhere in California, and there are ag workers everywhere in California. And I think that if you had someone speaking about the construction industry, they would say the same. Okay, so our study it's a qualitative study, and we were interested in the perceived occupational health and safety impacts of extreme weather. We were not only interested in wildfires, but other weather events, including drought, heat, rain, and the potential for increased risk in the workplace. And the goal of the project is to develop health and safety resources and tools that can be used by the agricultural community. So to do this, we identified 3 geographic areas in California: the Central Valley, the Imperial Valley, which is down close to the border with Mexico, and the Salinas Valley. And we conducted focus groups with farm workers. So we conducted 9 focus groups spread across those 3 regions. and 16 interviews with farmers. And so I'm just going to highlight some quotes from those discussions to illustrate a few key points. Okay, so first, the farm workers. And so for those not familiar with focus groups, they were groups of anywhere from 6 to 10 people in a room where we had a trained facilitator. All of this was done in Spanish, and raising key points and hearing the discussion and gathering the key themes. So farm workers are aware of the smoke. They work outside every day, and so they know that the climate is changing. The first quote states that they know the fire season each year is stronger, and it may not be near me, but the air travels. And so that's something that is definitely an issue in the Central Valley. A lot of the smoke from the Northern California fires went down south and settled in the Central Valley. That said, farm workers did not identify smoke or air quality as their highest concern from a safety perspective. Heat illness continues to be a major issue in their mind. And despite the hazardous conditions, whether they be from smoke or heat or another occupational hazard, farm workers are still going to work because, as someone said, rent had to be paid and food has to be bought. And so it's in that context that we need to be thinking about public policies and how to protect those people that have no choice but to work despite the unsafe conditions. So farm workers had varying knowledge of some protection measures. Some were aware of respirators and how they could use masks to protect themselves. Others thought that doubling up on bandanas would be sufficient. So if you've seen California farm workers, oftentimes there will be a handkerchief that people wear over their face, and this is done for multiple reasons. One is to limit the perceived goal of limiting exposure. And so the idea would be, well, if I wear two, I will be safe. And you can see a quote refers to that. Even a handkerchief would be a good way to prevent exposure. But then there are other barriers to the use of respirators, and I think that's really relevant as we are thinking about the potential emergency regulation, because there are factors that will inhibit people from using them, perhaps. Using respirators. So one is that supervisors play a really substantial role in the work culture and the safety culture. So this is an example of a supervisor who pointed at a box of masks and said, here they are, use them or don't, I don't care. And in some cases, that's good. At least there were masks available. I think that the hope is that supervisors, employers can do more to give instruction on how to use them and why they're important. On the flip side, not all workers want to wear a mask. They are not comfortable. Anyone who has worn one for more than a few minutes knows that they're not very comfortable. And farm workers are laboring outside in a lot of clothing in the heat for many, many hours. And so there's, I think, going to be resistance from them, even if a mask is made available because of that discomfort. Something that came up across the different extreme weather events that we talked to farm workers about was the role of supervisors. It can't be understated in the agricultural industry how important safety-minded leadership matters. And so a supervisor or a crew leader who wants to make safety a priority can really do that effectively, and the reverse is also true. And so farm workers see government as a resource. They see the potential for penalties, financial especially, as shaping the way that supervisors interact with their workers. A couple quotes that get at this. So one person said that the thing is, supervisors take a lot of care about the crops, but they don't care about the people who are harvesting them. And then another related to someone who didn't want to work in an extreme weather condition said, yeah, well, if one person doesn't do the work, they'll just find someone else who can. And so that's where things like immigration fears and low wages play into the fact that workers might be keeping themselves in situations that are not safe because they have no other choice or limited choices. Now, I'll transition to the farmers. We have a little bit less from farmers on wildfires specifically, in part because it wasn't on their radar the same way. And so farmers expressed very acute awareness of heat. The regulation is effective in making it heat an issue on their radar. Wind and rain also affect how they manage their crews and their crops. But this quote I think is interesting about fires. We've never set up protocols for that, smoke. It's not like rain that hits or doesn't. You don't see it coming. Sometimes you can see it, but it's more vague where you can measure it. We don't have means for measuring air quality. And that's really important, again, in the context of the proposed emergency regulation around wildfire smoke, because employers will need to measure air quality and will be responsible for giving their workers respirators if necessary. This highlights the role of employers and supervisors from a safety perspective, from the farmer perspective. And so in some cases, there's a lot of allowance of personal responsibility to the farm worker, that they know how to dress, they know how to take care of themselves. I'm not their parent, I'm not gonna tell them what to do. And then in contrast, there are growers who care quite a bit about their workers and want to ensure their safety. And so making decisions about how they are managing their work crews dependent on how their crews are doing in weather or other kinds of events. So I've mentioned this proposed regulation just for those who may not be familiar with it. The California or Cal OSHA Standards Board is considering an emergency petition to require employers to give respirators to their workers to use on a voluntary basis when the PM goes, let's see, AQI 150 is the current proposal. And so that's new, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that will roll out in the coming fire season. I think that our focus groups and interviews can help guide how we do outreach and education to make sure that the policy is implemented in the best way possible. So with that in mind, I think that we should be targeting training and outreach differently depending on the audience. Farm workers need to know about their rights. This is something that's true not only about wildfire smoke, but other topics as well. They need to know how to effectively use a respirator and not rely on their employer to give that instruction. That bandanas are not the same as an N95. And then also about the health effects of smoke. That's something that may not trickle down to everybody, and we need the general population, and then especially vulnerable populations, to know about the risks. Farmers need to know how to access air quality information. AQI may not be perfect, but it is available, and so they need to be educated on where to get that information. Similarly, best practices to protect their workers, effective training, and then what their responsibilities are. So on the one side, educating workers about their rights, and on the other, the employers about their responsibilities. In closing, really, I think that it's clear that air quality has been affecting California workers, outdoor workers, for many, many decades, and will continue to. Wildfires are not the only air quality concern in agriculture. But it is critical that approaches to address the effects of smoke on outdoor workers take into account the realities. A policy doesn't work unless we acknowledge where people are and what information they need to be safe in the workplace. And this includes the power dynamics that are at play in industries like agriculture. And we had great feedback from the farmers and farm workers. Without them, we couldn't have collected this information, so thanks to them. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.